The biting November wind whipped around Harrison Thorne, tugging at the lapels of his expensive cashmere coat, but he barely registered the cold. He stood a little way off from the sparse gathering, his gaze fixed on the small, freshly turned mound of earth. Around it, a handful of people huddled, their black attire stark against the gray, weeping sky and the muted greens and browns of the Maple Creek Cemetery. A young boy, no older than 10, stood slightly apart from them, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs, his face buried in his mother's side. Everyone else seemed to give the child a wide berth, lost in their own grief, or perhaps awkward in the face of such raw, youthful sorrow. Everyone but Harrison. He watched the boy, and something inside his meticulously constructed chest, something he usually kept locked down tighter than his company's proprietary algorithms, began to fracture. It was the way the boy's small hand clutched at his mother's coat, the utter desolation in his small, hunched frame. Harrison knew that feeling. He knew it like he knew the back of his own hand, like he knew the hollow echo in his sprawling, empty penthouse apartment. Slowly, as if drawn by an invisible thread, Harrison Thorne, CEO of Thorne and Associates, a man whose schedule was mapped in 5-minute increments and whose decisions impacted thousands, walked towards the crying child. He didn't know the family. He was here for a distant business acquaintance, a perfunctory appearance. But the boy. He reached them, his polished Italian leather shoes sinking slightly into the damp grass. The mother looked up, her eyes red-rimmed and wary, pulling her son closer. Harrison's own eyes, usually so sharp and analytical, were blurred. He knelt, the expensive fabric of his trousers pressing into the cold earth until he was level with the small, grieving figure. He didn't say a word. He just knelt there, a man in a perfectly tailored suit, and as he looked at the boy's tear-streaked face, a single hot tear escaped his own eye and traced a path down his cheek. Then another. And soon, Harrison Thorne, the titan of industry, was breaking down, quiet sobs racking his frame, right there in the cold, damp cemetery beside a child he'd never met. It was a grief unleashed. A grief for his own lost boy, Daniel, gone 15 years now, but as present in that moment as the wind on his face. The moment passed. He composed himself, a mask of stoic professionalism, sliding back into place as quickly as it had fallen. He offered a curt, mumbled apology to the bewildered mother, rose, and strode back to his waiting limousine, the brief, shocking display of vulnerability already being compartmentalized, filed away. By the time he reached the gleaming steel and glass tower of Thorne and Associates headquarters, he was Harrison Thorne, CEO again, formidable, untouchable, a man whose world revolved around profit margins, quarterly reports, and the relentless pursuit of more. The man who had wept in a cemetery was a ghost, a figment. His struggle was the crushing weight of expectation, both self-imposed and external. His desire, buried so deep he barely acknowledged it, was for something to alleviate the gnawing loneliness that his success had only amplified, a quiet yearning for the uncomplicated joy he'd last known when Daniel's small hand was in his. But such desires had no place in his world. His world was the 47th floor, a corner office with panoramic city views, and a board meeting in less than an hour to discuss the volatile acquisition of a rival tech firm, a deal that was threatening to unravel. Samuel Washington, meanwhile, was on the 3rd floor, meticulously polishing the already gleaming brass plaque outside the employee cafeteria. He was a tall, lean black man in his late 50s, his movements economical and precise, his expression habitually serene, though today a thoughtful furrow creased his brow. His uniform, a crisp navy blue, was immaculate. Samuel wasn't just a janitor at Thorne and Associates. He was an observer, a quiet fixture in the building's daily rhythm for the past 10 years. He saw the harried assistants rushing with coffee, the young executives puffed with ambition, the older ones weary with the weight of their responsibilities. He saw Mr. Thorne, too, on the rare occasions the CEO ventured below the executive floors, a whirlwind of focused energy, always on his phone, his face a mask of intense concentration, a coterie of anxious-looking people usually trailing in his wake. Samuel's struggle was a quiet one, the daily grind of making ends meet, of ensuring his granddaughter Lily, who lived with him and his wife Sarah, had everything she needed, especially the expensive medication for her asthma. His desire was simple: peace, a good life for Lily, and perhaps one day to finish the engineering degree he'd had to abandon decades ago when life threw him a curveball. He still tinkered in his small workshop at home, his mind sharp, his hands skilled. He'd even designed a more efficient cleaning schedule for his floors at Thorne and Associates, a system that saved time and resources, though he'd never mentioned it to management. Who would listen to a janitor? He knew today was a high-pressure day. The tension in the building was palpable, a low hum of anxiety that even reached his relatively calm domain. He'd heard snippets of conversation. The Omnicorp deal, Thorne's on the warpath, make or break. He just hoped everyone kept their coffee to themselves and didn't add to his workload with stress-induced spills. He took pride in his work, in the cleanliness and order he brought to his small corner of this corporate giant. The mystery, if there was one, was Samuel himself. To most, he was just part of the background, a necessary but invisible cog. Few knew of his sharp intellect, his quiet dignity, or the depth of his observations, and no one, least of all Harrison Thorne, could have predicted the role Samuel Washington was about to play in the company's future, a role that would begin with a moment of unexpected, raw collision. The stage was set, the characters moving, towards an intersection they couldn't foresee, an intersection that would challenge everything Harrison Thorne believed about power, respect, and the true measure of a man. The audience, watching this unfold, would feel the subtle threads of connection, the unspoken pains and wonder. What happens when these two worlds, so close in proximity, yet light years apart in status, finally truly meet? The pressure on Harrison. Thorne had been mounting for weeks, a relentless siege on his focus and his patience. The Omnicorp acquisition was proving to be a viper's nest of complications, regulatory hurdles, shareholder anxieties, and whispers of a last-minute counteroffer from a formidable competitor. Sleep had become a luxury he couldn't afford. Meals were snatched at his desk, and his temper, usually kept on a tight leash, was fraying. The image of the crying boy, his own uncharacteristic breakdown in the cemetery, kept intruding at odd moments, a crack in his armor he couldn't quite seal. It made him feel weak, exposed, and he hated it. He compensated by becoming even more demanding, more critical, his voice sharper, his expectations higher. His staff tiptoed around him, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and resentment. His backstory was one of relentless ambition fueled by a deep-seated insecurity. Born to a family of modest means, he'd clawed his way to the top through sheer grit and a brilliant mind, sacrificing personal relationships and his own well-being on the altar of success. Daniel's death, from a rare childhood illness, had been the ultimate, unbearable loss. His wife, unable to cope with their shared grief, and Harrison's subsequent emotional withdrawal, had left him a few years later. Thorne and Associates became his only refuge, his only battlefield, the only place where he felt in control. But the control was an illusion, and the loneliness was a cancer. Samuel Washington's life, in contrast, was rich in ways Harrison's was barren. His small apartment, though sometimes a struggle to maintain, was filled with the warmth of family. His wife Sarah was his rock, her laughter a balm to his worries. Lily, his granddaughter, was his sunshine, her bright, curious mind a constant source of joy and inspiration. Her asthma attacks were terrifying, a stark reminder of their financial vulnerability. But they faced them together. Samuel's earlier dream of becoming an engineer had been deferred when his own father fell ill, and he'd taken on the responsibility of supporting his family. He'd worked various jobs, always with diligence and integrity, before landing the position at Thorne and Associates. He didn't resent his path. He believed every job had dignity if done well. But sometimes, late at night, in his small workshop, surrounded by his tools and half-finished projects, he would allow himself to dream of what if. He'd recently been working on a prototype for a new type of air filtration unit, inspired by Lily's struggles, something small, efficient, and affordable. It was a long shot, but it kept his mind engaged, his hope alive. The conflict was brewing, an inevitable storm. It happened on a Tuesday morning, the day of the crucial Omnicorp board presentation. Harrison was pacing his office like a caged tiger, his tie loosened, his hair disheveled. A critical data projection was missing. His CFO was stuck in traffic, and he'd just had a blistering argument with the lead counsel over a contractual clause. He was a volcano on the verge of eruption. He stormed out of his office, heading for the emergency stairwell, needing to walk to burn off the furious energy. He was taking the stairs down, 2 at a time, when he rounded a landing on the 35th floor, a floor usually quieter, housing archives and rarely used meeting rooms. Samuel Washington was there, carefully buffing a small scuff mark on the linoleum floor. He was humming a soft, almost inaudible spiritual, a tune of quiet resilience. He didn't see Harrison approach, his back partially turned. Harrison, lost. In his own tempest, barely registered Samuel as a person. He saw only an obstacle, a delay. "Out of the way!" he barked, his voice like a whip crack. Samuel, startled, straightened up, his buffer falling silent. He moved aside, but not quite fast enough for Harrison's liking. Harrison's shoulder brushed against Samuel's arm. "Can't you see I'm in a hurry?" Harrison snarled, his face contorted with rage. "Some of us have actual work to do, important work, not just this." He gestured dismissively at Samuel's cleaning cart, his eyes blazing with a fury that had little to do with the janitor and everything to do with the collapsing deal and the gaping hole in his own life. Just do your job and stay invisible. That's what you're paid for, isn't it? The words, sharp and cruel, hung in the sterile air of the stairwell. Samuel stood, stunned into silence for a moment. His dark eyes, usually so calm, flickered with a deep hurt, a profound disappointment. He looked at Harrison Thorne, truly looked at him, and saw not just a powerful CEO but a man unraveling, a man drowning in his own bitterness. He saw the flicker of that cemetery grief Harrison thought he'd hidden so well, a raw pain lashing out. Samuel didn't retort. He didn't raise his voice. He simply held Harrison's gaze for a long moment, his own expression a mixture of sorrow and an unyielding dignity. Then, he said, his voice low and steady, imbued with a quiet power that seemed to absorb Harrison's rage. "Mr. Thorne, I am always doing my job, and I see a great deal, perhaps more than you realize." He paused, then added softly, "I hope your day gets better, sir. I truly do." Then Samuel Washington turned, picked up his buffer, and calmly resumed his work, leaving Harrison Thorne standing alone in the stairwell, the echo of his own ugly words ringing in his ears. For the first time in a long time, Harrison felt a prickle of something other than anger or stress. It might have been shame. He tried to shake it off, telling himself the janitor was nobody, the encounter insignificant. But Samuel's eyes, and his quiet, dignified response, lingered. The injustice of his own outburst was a bitter taste in his mouth. He proceeded to the board meeting, his mood fouler than ever, but now with an added layer of disquiet. The carefully constructed walls around Harrison Thorne had been breached, not by a business rival, but by the quiet integrity of a man he had tried to render invisible. The suspense wasn't just about the Omnicorp deal anymore. It was about the reverberations of this seemingly small, brutal encounter. The board meeting was a disaster. Harrison, usually so commanding and articulate, was off his game. His arguments felt hollow, his responses defensive. Samuel's words, "I see a great deal, perhaps more than you realize," kept replaying in his mind, an unsettling counterpoint to the financial jargon and corporate posturing filling the room. The missing data projection, when it finally arrived, was less than stellar, and the news of the competitor's aggressive counteroffer cast a pall over the proceedings. The board members, a collection of stern-faced men and women who had weathered many storms with Thorne and Associates, were visibly concerned. Marcus Albright, a veteran board member and once a mentor to Harrison, looked particularly grim. Harrison left the meeting feeling defeated, the weight of impending failure pressing down on him. He retreated to his office, sinking into his leather chair, the panoramic view of the city offering no comfort. He felt that old, familiar loneliness creep in, colder and more biting than ever. And then he remembered Samuel's eyes, the hurt in them, but also the strange, unwavering calm. "I hope your day gets better, sir." No one had said anything remotely kind to him in weeks. Over the next few days, an uneasy truce settled over Thorne and Associates. The Omnicorp deal hung in the balance, negotiations stalled. Harrison was coiled tight, a spring of suppressed anxiety. He found himself noticing Samuel Washington during his rare trips through the lower floors. The janitor was always there, diligent, quiet, never meeting his eye directly, yet Harrison felt observed, not in an accusatory way, but with a kind of gentle, knowing presence. It was unnerving. He even thought he saw Samuel leaving a small polished apple on the corner of his assistant's desk one morning, a desk usually overflowing with half-eaten protein bars and discarded coffee cups. A small, human gesture in a world of cold transactions. The turning point began subtly. Harrison, plagued by insomnia, was in the office late one evening, long after everyone else had gone home. He was wrestling with a particularly thorny clause in the Omnicorp contract, his mind a fog of legalese and financial projections. He'd been staring at the same paragraph for an hour, getting nowhere. He decided to walk, to clear his head. The building was silent, a ghost of its daytime self. As he passed the darkened cafeteria on the third floor, he saw a light on in the janitorial supply closet. Curiosity, an emotion he rarely indulged, got the better of him. He pushed the door open gently. Samuel Washington was there, not cleaning, but bent over a small makeshift workbench, a soldering iron in his hand, his brow furrowed in concentration as he worked on a small, intricate device. Wires, circuit boards, and what looked like miniature fans were spread out before him. He was so engrossed he didn't hear Harrison enter. Harrison watched for a moment, surprised. This was a side of the janitor he couldn't have imagined. "Samuel," he said, his voice softer than he intended. Samuel looked up, startled, a flicker of apprehension in his eyes before his usual composure returned. "Mr. Thorne, I was just finishing up." He made a move to cover his project. "What is that?" Harrison asked, stepping closer, genuinely intrigued despite himself. Samuel hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. It's an idea I've been working on, sir. A personal project." He gestured to the device. "It's a compact air filtration unit, for small spaces, high efficiency, low power." Harrison, whose company was trying to acquire a tech firm, found himself looking at the device with an engineer's eye, a part of him he'd suppressed for years under layers of corporate strategy. He'd studied engineering in his youth before. The lure of business had taken over. He saw the ingenuity in Samuel's design, the clever use of materials, the practical application. "Why?" Harrison asked. Samuel's gaze softened. "My granddaughter, Lily. She has severe asthma. The air quality in our apartment building, it's not always the best. Store-bought units are expensive and the filters, well, I thought maybe I could make something better, something affordable for folks like us." His voice was filled with a quiet passion, the love for his granddaughter evident in every word. Harrison picked up the prototype. It was surprisingly well made, the soldering neat, the design thoughtful. He asked a few technical questions, and Samuel answered them with a clarity and understanding that belied his position as a janitor. They talked for nearly half an hour, not as CEO and janitor, but as two men discussing an engineering problem. For Harrison, it was a breath of fresh air, a connection to a part of himself he thought long dead. He saw the intelligence in Samuel's eyes, the quiet brilliance he'd been too blind, too arrogant to notice before. As Harrison was about to leave, Samuel said, "Mr. Thorne, about the other day, in the stairwell, Harrison held up a hand. "No, Samuel. I was the one out of line. Unforgivably so, I apologize." The words felt foreign on his tongue, yet strangely liberating. Samuel simply nodded, a hint of a smile touching his lips. "We all have our burdens to carry, sir." Harrison walked back to his office, the encounter replaying in his mind. An idea, audacious and unexpected, began to form. It was a long shot, a gamble, but the potential, it was more exciting than the Omnicorp deal had ever been. Hope, a fragile seedling, began to push through the permafrost of his cynicism. He looked at the Omnicorp contract, then at the memory of Samuel's humble workshop, his ingenious little device born out of love and necessity. The path forward suddenly seemed a little clearer, and it had nothing to do with hostile takeovers. The next morning, Harrison Thorne did something he hadn't done in years. He called an emergency, all-hands board meeting, but he didn't send out the usual agenda of financial reports and strategic alignments. The only item on the agenda was a new direction. The board members filed into the imposing mahogany-paneled room, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Marcus Albright shot Harrison a questioning look, but Harrison merely offered a calm, enigmatic smile. Once everyone was settled, Harrison stood, not at the head of the long, polished table, but to the side, near the large presentation screen. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady and clear, devoid of its usual harsh edge. "For the past few months, we've been singularly focused on the Omnicorp acquisition. It has been challenging. Understatement of the year. And I've come to a realization. Perhaps we've been looking for growth, for innovation, in the wrong places." He paused, letting his words sink in. Then he said, "I want to introduce you to someone." He pressed a button on his remote, and the doors at the far end of the boardroom opened. Samuel Washington walked in. He was wearing his usual, immaculate janitorial uniform, but he carried himself with a quiet dignity that filled the room. He looked surprised, a little nervous, but also resolute. He held his small air filtration prototype in his hands. The board members stared, first in stunned silence, then in bewildered, hushed whispers. "What is the meaning of this, Harrison?" One of them, a notoriously stuffy director named Peterson, finally sputtered. Harrison ignored him, his gaze on Samuel. "This is Samuel Washington. He's been a valued member of the Thorne and Associates team for over 10 years. He then turned to the board. "And he is, I believe, an innovator whose work might just represent the future of this company." For the next hour, Harrison Thorne, with Samuel Washington by his side, did not talk about hostile takeovers or market shares. Instead, he talked about grassroots innovation, about social responsibility, about tapping into the hidden talents within their own organization. He had Samuel explain his air filtration device, his motivations, his meticulous research. Samuel, though initially hesitant, spoke with eloquence and passion about the need for affordable clean air technology, about his granddaughter Lily, about the potential to help thousands, perhaps millions of people. He didn't use corporate jargon. He spoke from the heart, his engineering knowledge shining through. The board was, as the story's title promised, stunned. Some were skeptical, others openly dismissive. Peterson scoffed. "Are you seriously suggesting we abandon a multi-million-dollar acquisition to pursue a janitor's hobby project?" Harrison met his gaze, his calmness unshakable. "I'm suggesting, Mr. Peterson, that we look at value beyond the immediate balance sheet. I'm suggesting we invest in people, in ideas that can genuinely make a difference. Samuel's device, he held up the small prototype, is more than a hobby. It's a brilliant piece of engineering born from necessity and love. It's elegant, efficient, and addresses a critical global need. With our resources, our R&D, our marketing reach, imagine the impact. Marcus Albright, who had been listening intently, finally spoke, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Harrison," he said, his voice filled with a newfound respect. "This is the boldest, most interesting idea you've brought to this board in years. Tell us more about the potential market, the development costs, the philanthropic angle." The tide began to turn. Harrison presented a preliminary plan he'd stayed up all night drafting. A new subsidiary focused on accessible environmental technology, with Samuel Washington offered a leading role in its R&D, along with a full scholarship to complete his engineering degree, funded by the company. He proposed redirecting a portion of the Omnicorp acquisition fund to seed this new venture. It was radical, unexpected, but as Harrison spoke, his earlier passion for engineering reignited, his vision clear and compelling. Even the most hardened skeptics began to see the possibilities. They saw the potential for a massive PR win, AI boost in employee morale, and yes, even significant long-term profit in a burgeoning market. The resolution was not instantaneous, but the seed was planted. The Omnicorp deal was eventually scaled back, pursued as a more modest strategic partnership rather than a full acquisition. And Thorne Clean Air, the new subsidiary, was born. Samuel Washington, the janitor, became Samuel Washington, head of innovation for the new venture, his small workshop exchanged for a state-of-the-art lab.
He accepted the position with humility and a quiet determination, his first act being to ensure that a percentage of future profits would go towards providing free units to low-income families and asthma clinics. Harrison Thorne found a different
kind of success, one that didn't leave him feeling hollow. He worked closely with Samuel, the two men forming an unlikely but powerful partnership. The CEO, once feared, began to be respected, even liked. He started listening to his employees, from the mailroom to the executive suites, realizing the wealth of untapped talent and ideas within his own walls. He even started leaving the office at a reasonable hour, sometimes visiting the small park near his penthouse, not to mourn, but to simply breathe, to observe, to feel connected to the world again. He was still a driven man, but his drive was now tempered with empathy, with a broader sense of purpose. The full circle came a year later. Thorne Clean Air launched its first product, the Lily Pure unit, named after Samuel's granddaughter. It was an immediate success, lauded for its design, efficiency, and affordability. Harrison and Samuel stood side by side at the product launch, the press flashing cameras, the applause genuine. Later that day, Harrison found himself walking past the 35th floor stairwell. He paused, remembering that ugly, transformative encounter. He no longer saw just a scuff mark on the floor. He saw a turning point, a moment of grace disguised as a moment of shame. He thought of the cemetery, of the man he had been, kneeling in the cold, lost in a grief he couldn't share. He was still that man, in part. The loss of Daniel would always be a part of him. But now there was something more. There was connection. There was purpose beyond profit. He had, in a way, found another child to help, another future to build, inspired by a man his former self would have dismissed without a second thought. The tearjerker takeaway wasn't just about one man's redemption or another's unexpected rise. It was about the profound truth that every single person, regardless of their title or station, carries within them a unique spark, a potential for brilliance, for kindness, for impact. It was about the courage to see that spark in others and to allow it to ignite something within oneself. Harrison Thorne learned that true vision isn't about looking down from the top of a skyscraper, but about seeing clearly, at eye level, the humanity and worth in everyone you meet. And sometimes, the most valuable assets a company possesses aren't on any balance sheet. They're walking the halls, quietly doing their work, waiting only for someone to finally, truly see them. The entire corporate world might not have changed overnight, but within the walls of Thorne and Associates, something fundamental had shifted, all because one busy executive finally stopped and listened to the janitor. And in doing so, he had not just found a new direction for his company, but for his own soul.